Kane University in New Jersey, where he teaches courses in ancient and medieval history. That happens to be my alma mater for my BA, and I love Kane, so that's something that I was really interested in to see that you were from Kane. He is a specialist in medieval and church history, and this talk is based on his latest book, The Secret History of a Lost Virtue, from Georgetown University Press. He's won two grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities. They are very hard to get, so getting just one is a big deal. One of our faculty just got one recently, and we were really excited. Dr. Alfani. Dr. Belito has had 2 of these. He's been a visiting scholar at Princeton Theological Seminary and a Fulbright specialist in New Zealand and the Netherlands. And he was telling me about his trip to New Zealand where he got to visit what's, the Lord of the Rings sites and everything like that. So, that just sounded amazing. He also serves as series editor-in-chief of the Brill's Companion to the Christian Tradition, which actually we had a connection with that as well, because I had an essay in one of those volumes, and an academic editor at large for Paulus Press. So I'm really so excited to have him here talking to us about a virtue that I think, calling it a lost virtue is such an important thing, because we are in a society where, people just don't even want to think about humility. What we were just talking about in art class, which is, of course, dealing with the works of Tolkien and Lewis and their precursors, we were looking at a medieval text where humility is really, really important in that text. It's kind of, you could almost say, a central message. Humility is not, at least the way we were talking about in class, it's not putting yourself down. It's realizing that what you gifts are, and realizing that they are gifts, and using them for others. So I think that's an important lesson, I think, that we were just talking about on Monday. And so I hope everybody here, especially the students, asks questions. And Dr. Belito is going to be speaking for about 45 minutes, and then there'll be plenty of time for questions and answers. And we do have refreshments, so if you haven't gotten them before, there'll be time to get them after. So thank you so much, Dr. Belito.
Thanks so much for having me. Thanks to the Corps and to the Institute of Catholic Studies and Gloria. Personally, there are people who you don't know who they are, you don't know their names, but they make everything go, and Gloria is one of those. So I want to say thank you to Gloria for doing that.
I'm sorry, I forgot to say who I was. I realized.
Oh, Dr. Nancy Enright,
Yeah.
Director of the Corps.
If you don't know
You probably have gotten emails from her, and you don't know who she is. So what I want to do in this 45 minutes is kind of first talk a little bit about the genesis of the book. How do you go about writing a book on humility? I have friends who are like, you're writing a book on humility. I was trained by Jesuits. The Jesuits taught me many things. Humility was not one of them. So this is not one of those books where people go through recovery and say, I used to be very heavy and now I'm skinny, and if you follow my 12 steps, you can do that. This is not a lab. I'm not presenting myself in any great way as a model of humility. So the first bit is to talk about how I came to write this book, and the second bit is really the guts. I want to walk you through the book. Being an historian, hooray, we do things chronologically. So I'm going to go from the ancient world to the modern world. And then the last bit, I want to answer the question, so what? There was a great Jesuit church historian named John O'Malley who died at the age of 95. And at the end of every class or every talk, he would always say, so what? Who cares? What's the takeaway? Why should we care about humility in the world in which we live today? So that's kind of my plan. Every book I write, when I'm done with a book, as I'm working on a book, you know what the next project is. Ironically, I just did a podcast on this book on Monday, and I was asked what your next book is, and the answer is I don't know, because nothing emerged. And it could be that this is the last book I write, and at the age of 58, that would be fine with me. But as I was doing a book called Ageless Wisdom, Lifetime Lessons for the Bible, being a good Catholic, I had never read the Bible from the beginning to the end. Catholics don't read the Bible. We just read little pieces of it. And so it took me 4 months, and I was interested in the interplay of wisdom and age. And as I was reading that book, humility came up, but it was complicating the book. So I literally took a box and was marked the next project, and I threw stuff into the box. And so when I was done with that, this book obviously delayed by COVID and things like that, things like this. Up until the very end, the name of this project was a biography. Humility, a biography of the lost virtue. I wanted to tell the lifestyle. But as I was shopping the book around, and there are flyers in the back for ordering, as I was shopping the book around, the editor at Georgetown University Press said that biography wasn't, to use his words, sexy enough, and that if we called it secret history, we might sell more books. So I was all great for that. I want you to pay close attention to this image, because I'm going to come back to this image. This is from a Thomas Cole painting. And when you see the entire image, I think you'll see why we chose this detail from this painting when we get there. So, of course, the problem of talking about humility is that no one can say, follow my example. Look how humble I am, right? And so the epigram for the book comes from a rabbi partner. I do a lot of work. Hi, Aaron. I do a lot of work with I live in Freehold, New Jersey, and he and I do Jewish-Christian dialogue. And he came up with this famous proverb that I had never heard about: too humble is half proud. And that's the problem with studying humility. So I lay that out there in the front as a complicating notion. Now I know that in this course, your course, we're talking a lot about Tolkien and we're talking a lot about C.S. Lewis. So I want to tell you how complicated it is to talk about humility by using an example from the Screwtape Letters. So this is C.S. Lewis, and C.S. Lewis in 1942, when the world was tearing itself apart because of the egos of people, he does a series of radio talks that become a book, and the book is called the Screwtape Letters. Screwtape is an undersecretary in hell who has assigned his nephew Wormwood his first soul to corrupt, and the soul is called the patient. And God is the enemy, capital E. And he says, for instance, Screwtape says to Wormwood, let your patient fall in lust. There's no problem with that. That's good. He'll sin. But don't let him fall in love, because then he'll understand who God is, showing that difference. So in this particular passage, he hears that the patient has become humble. Now look at the irony here. Screwtape writing to Wormwood, talking about this soul he's supposed to corrupt. Your patient has become humble. Have you drawn his attention to this fact? Catch him at the moment when he was really poor in spirit and smuggle into his mind the gratifying reflection, by Jove, I'm being humble. And almost immediately, pride. Pride as his own humility will appear. If he awakens to the danger and tries to smother this new form of pride, make him proud of his attempt. So, really, you're fighting against this notion. How central is humility to the Christian experience? And I should open a parenthesis here and say, you need not be a believer in order to understand humility, because polytheists talk about humility too. And you can understand and appreciate the Jewish, Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, Confucian contributions to humility without being a Buddhist or a Hindu or a Confucian. And so Augustine, someone you probably have met, wrote the Confessions, one of the most famous conversion stories. When asked to name the three most important virtues, said humility, humility, and humility. In real estate, it's location, location, and location. Hildegard of Bingen, who is someone you really, really need to meet, a real, to put it mildly, badass woman in the Middle Ages, she wrote a play about the virtues, and the queen of the virtues is humility. And in this particular play, none of the other virtues know what to do without her. She's the quarterback. She's the captain of the team. And when the captain of the team goes down, enter New York Jets joke here, nobody knows what to do. And when Flannery O'Connor, someone else you might meet in one of the corps, was asked to name the great Catholic sin, she said the opposite of humility, which is smugness. When I was writing this book and not being very charitable and looking at the news and looking at particular politicians that I don't like, whom I will not name, I would sometimes want to write a chapter called Blessed Are the Smug. Nowhere do we read Blessed Are the Smug. We read Blessed Are the Meek, and we'll talk about that in a second. So what are the dangers of pride? Now I should say that when we're talking about pride, pride can be fine. You know, when my daughter was growing up, we wanted her to be proud of what she's done. I'm proud of this book. There's nothing wrong with that. It's the pride that goes too far. It's what the Greeks called hybris. It's what we call arrogance. When we think we're better than somebody else because we are, fill in the blank, smart and they're dumb, or we think they're dumb. We're Democrats and they're Republicans, so we're smart and they're dumb. Or we're Republicans and they're Democrats, so we're smart and they're dumb. Or we're male and they're female. Or we're white and they're not. And so it's this notion that I am better than other people, and here's the problem, and the hell with those other people. There's this empathy gap. I don't know how you feel about masks and COVID, but I think the whole messaging about masks was off. We told people, wear a mask and protect other people. Americans don't care about other people. If we said, wear a mask and protect yourself, everybody would have been wearing masks with American flags on them. Right? That's what's called an empathy gap. That's what's called an empathy gap. And so we're so sure that we have the answer that there's no need to ask anyone else. Why would I ask anyone else? I'm smarter than everybody else. And what happens to Macbeth and Lady Macbeth is that they trust so much in their own certitude that they destroy themselves. And that's the fear, that hubris. If you read Greek mythology, the reason you fall is you. It's not the god's fault. It's your virtue, persistence, that goes too far, stubbornness. It's your virtue, pride, that goes too far, arrogance. And so that's what makes Greek tragedy. And so, captured very well in this was a famous Swiss historian named Jakob Burckhardt, who was at the museum in Basel in Switzerland, and he gave this famous lecture on the fortune and misfortune in history. And in this lecture, he says, when we think we have it right, then we have no problem denying rights to others, because those other people are not really people. They're less than we are. They are, so now we start to think of, well, can people be that? Well, think of Nazism, right? What did the Nazis do? They don't say Jews are bad people. They say Jews are not people. Think of slavery in the American context as well. So it's a very bad management principle. And we are not the center of the universe. Now, we all think that this is the center of the universe, and that my one of these is the center of the universe, and I can find all sorts of information. But the internet can give me information. It can't give me knowledge, and it can't give me understanding, and it can't give me wisdom. This is why AI chatbots will lead you down the bad road, because they can't think. They can gather information, but they can't think. And as I tell my students, if you use a chatbot, you're actually really bad, because I have freshmen who start to put in their essays, whilst. Nobody says whilst. Or you're writing an essay on Sir Gawain, and all of a sudden there's a U in honor. I can figure out that you went to Australia to get that. Some Australian website. So just don't do it. Now, unfortunately, Jakob Burckhardt is speaking in the language, the male-dominated patriarchal language of his age, so we'll put human being. For each human being regards all time as fulfilled in his own, and cannot see his own one as many passing waves. This is why if you travel to Europe, or to Egypt, or to China, and you see these things that are thousands of years old, you feel small. Good. Right? We are just one moment in a chapter, receiving and handing things on. Just as if the world and its history had existed merely for our sakes. And so an historical perspective makes you realize that you are just a piece in the chapter. And humility can help us do this. And so the image that was taken from the book, for the book's cover, is this piece right here. And it's of 5 huge paintings. Each painting is this size. And if you go to the New York Historical Society, which is next to the Museum of Natural History on Central Park West, you will see these 5 paintings in a row. Pre-Rome, early Rome, the glory of Rome, the destruction of Rome, and what's left. And it's called The Course of Empire. And the reason we chose this piece was because there's something there. There's something important that is past that we want to recover. And it's that virtue that we want to recover. So how did it's 2:20,
Yeah.
and the national alert system is working.
I forgot to say it. I meant to tell you, if you haven't heard the announcement, it's not anything, just a test.
And apparently, the United States government does not want us to think about humility. So, how did I write this book? I started at the beginning, because that's what historians do, and I gathered source material, because that's what historians do. And I laid it out in order, and then I read it in order. So I went back to ancient sources, and I said, where does the word humility come from? And it comes from the word humus, not hummus, that's the chickpea stuff in there, meaning of the earth, soil, loam. We are made of the earth. God created people from the earth, from clay, and breathed life into it, all right? So there's something fundamental, because if we are not grounded, right, in virtue, we will fly off into vice. And then I looked at Jewish, Christian, and Muslim commentaries, Jewish, Christian, and we'll have to turn mine off too, I guess. Jewish, Christian, and Muslim commentaries, Greco-Roman stuff, the Middle Ages, and then modern literature, and modern philosophy. So what do we find? What we find in the ancient world are 2 strands. One positive and one negative. We'll begin with the positive. If you read the earliest sources of Hebrew literature, what Jews call the Old Testament, Christians call Jewish scripture. So I'm talking about Jewish scripture, right? Jewish scripture has the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Fear doesn't mean I'm afraid of flunking an exam. It means awe. And so when Moses encounters Yahweh in the burning bush, he takes his shoes off as a recognition that he is less than Yahweh. But it doesn't mean that he's crap. It just means there's something bigger than I am. So your smallness relative to Yahweh, Moses' smallness relative to God's bigness, doesn't mean you're no good. It just puts you in the relative position. And so you understand your way in a broader context. And an example of this is on Yom Kippur, which our Jewish sisters and brothers just celebrated, you ask God for forgiveness. But the night before Yom Kippur is actually more important. And that's called Erev Yom Kippur. And Erev means vigil, night before, pre. And on Erev Yom Kippur, you are supposed to go and ask the people you have offended for forgiveness, which is a lot harder than asking God for forgiveness, because you don't have to look God in the eye and say, I hurt you. Because who's going to do that? That makes you vulnerable. What moron would do that? We're Americans. We strut, right? And if you stood up, you could probably beat the crap out of me. So just stay right where you are. And so it's related to words like humble and meekness. And I talk about meekness because Jesus is going to talk about meekness in a sense. So it's a self-understanding that I am not always doing something right. Because if I was always doing something right, I wouldn't have to apologize. Have you ever heard that line? It's the dumbest line in music history, in movie history. Love means never having to say you're sorry. It is trust me, I've been married 30 years. Not a day goes by that I don't say, I'm sorry. But who wants to say that? Nobody wants to say that. So I'm just going to skip along a little bit to a negative. So in the ancient world, we have these 2 traditions. A negative tradition of humility and a positive tradition of humility. We've talked about the positive, now we want to look at the negative. You may know the Greek figure of Narcissus. Narcissus, who was so in love with himself, you psych majors, this is where narcissism comes from. Megalomania comes from. that he can't even notice that there's this, not only this beautiful, but this beautiful naked woman in front of him because he's too busy looking at someone that he thinks is much more beautiful himself. And according to various versions, easy to see in this one, he actually falls into the lake and drowns because he's trying to kiss his beloved, who is himself. We know people who are in love with themselves. Now, splitting the difference between the good and the bad is this guy named Aristotle. So Socrates taught Plato. Plato taught Aristotle. Okay? Aristotle doesn't say, as we do, that a virtue and a vice are opposites. Aristotle says something that we need to remember, and that is moderation. What he says is virtue sits between two vices. Now, being a moderate in American society is impossible, because you're either Fox or you're MSNBC, and there ain't nothing in the middle, right? And I don't know about you, but when I watch politicians yelling and screaming, I'd rather feel like I didn't grow up as a child of divorce, but people who have told me that it's like sitting there watching your parents argue. Being a moderate is now a radical position. People say, is Pope Francis a revolutionary? No, he's a radical moderate. But being a moderate is now radical. Aristotle says virtue is radical. So, to use an example, bravery sits between recklessness, putting yourself in danger for no reason, and cowardice, not acting when you should. Virtue, humility, what he calls pride, we call humility, sits between thinking too little of yourself, humiliation, low self-esteem, and too much of yourself, arrogance, hubris, narcissus. Right? And what goes up must come down. So the famous story of Daedalus, the craftsman who does the rabbit war in the maze in Crete for the Minotaur. He's trying to escape. He fashions wings out of feathers and wax for him and his son, Daedalus. He tells Daedalus, don't fly too close to the sun. What does Daedalus do? We always do what our parents tell us not to do. We fly too close to the sun. The wax melts because of the heat, and Daedalus falls. A metaphor for overreaching. Overreaching, okay? So you've got these two twin strands, and then along comes the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire has no concept of humility as a virtue. It's all a vice. The Romans come into town, and they basically say, listen, dudes, we can do things one of two ways. We can do this my way, or we can do this my way. Either way, I win and you lose. And if you lose, they actually make you, this is the ancient game of limbo, they actually make you walk under one spear, one spear, one spear, called the yoke. And you have to walk under the yoke, and sometimes bend under the yoke to say, I am less than the Romans. Oh, Romans, please don't kill us. Right? So slaves have no meaning. POWs have no meaning. Even free women, essentially, have no meaning. And then along comes Jesus, who says, blessed are the meek. Who says to slaves, you are free. Who says to women, before he says to men, I am Jesus, the Son of God, who reveals his resurrection first to a woman and not to men. And so when Jesus says, blessed are the meek, he says, blessed are the people who are low on the social scale, women and slaves principally, Jews in the Roman Empire, but you are great. And so he says things that the Romans can't understand. Wait a second, the last shall be first and the first shall be last? Those who exalt themselves shall be humbled? That doesn't make any sense, because the Roman Empire are like, you ever watch football games? I can't stand it. People do the simplest thing. They tackle somebody and they stand up and they start walking. I tell my students, I want to do this all the time. I want to grade an essay and then stand up. You know, like, I'm pretty good at what I do, but I don't strut. I don't understand why we're strutting so much. I just don't get it. So, this Jesus, who is God, washes the feet. God washes the feet of human beings. And this freaks the Romans out. So when we go into the early period, and I asked my Muslim friends, scholars, what's the word for humility in Islam? They all said, well, we don't have one. I can't tell you how many people I asked. It's kind of like patience, it's kind of like submission, but it's all tied into basically Moses' notion that there is something greater than I am, Allah, that I am created by that creator, which makes me good, but I'm not God. I'm a lot of things, but I'm not God. And so Allah increases honor, and no one humbles himself for the sake of Allah, except that Allah raises his status, is an echo of what we find in Matthew and Luke. Anyone who exalts himself shall be humbled, and those who humble themselves shall be exalted. And so we get to the Middle Ages, and for me, the 2 chapters on the Middle Ages, because I'm a medievalist, and that's the most important time in history, right? Right? I used to say nothing important happens after 1600. You're having a heart attack. And so my colleagues get mad at me, so now I say nothing much important happens after 1600. I think that's fair, right? And in the Middle Ages, we have this concept of learned ignorance. Very odd concept. What does it mean? It means I know that there are limits to my knowledge. That I can go so far, but I can't know it all. You have an obligation to go as far as your brain can tell you, but you also have an obligation to stay inside the guardrails. There's a famous guy named Nicholas of Cusa, and Nicholas of Cusa says, God is a circle. The closest we can get to God is a polygon inside that circle. You could press the edges of that polygon as far as you possibly can go, but it will never be a circle. There will always be limits between what I know and the fullness of knowledge. And a very famous guy at the University of Paris, who was chancellor, would be like our provost, called discretion the daughter of humility. Because once you have a humble attitude toward knowledge, then you understand, like Socrates, what you don't know, and that'll stop you from strutting. It'll always make you learning. And so the question then becomes, because Plato and Aristotle were asking, well, what makes a good society? What makes a good society is, I know I'm good at this. But when your toilet doesn't flush, you don't call an electrician. You call a plumber. Each needs each other, and needs someone else, and needs someone else. So the sense of humility becomes important for civil society because we realize none of us has all of the answers. Look at COVID. Was COVID a medical issue? Yes. Was it a scientific issue? Yes. Was it a social economic issue? Well, when blacks and Latinos are dying at a higher rate, yes. 1 million Americans died of COVID. Does anyone know the percentage, the highest percentage of people who died? 3 out of every 4 people who died, 3 out of every 4 Americans who died were over the age of 65. What did we lose? Of their wisdom, incalculable, of their wisdom, of their experience. Something's wrong with that statistic. So this becomes a policy issue. This becomes an economic issue. It becomes a political issue, right? We can't all figure it out. Now, humility really, really gets lost in the modern world with the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. And if I wanted to say, hello, Central Casting, Hollywood, show me someone who strutted and was not humble in the early modern world, and they would send me David Hume. And the best/worst example that I could give you is David Hume writing in a treatise on human nature, where he dismisses humility in the worst terms. Every valuable quality of the mind, whether imagination, judgment, memory, disposition, wit, good sense, learning, courage, justice, integrity, all these are the causes of pride, and they're opposites of humility. Humility is shame, not satisfaction. Shame of our looks, our skills, our positions, and our accomplishments. And who would want to be like that, he says. And you should probably hear the music to Jaws playing. And every Greco-Roman myth you've ever heard, and every Shakespearean tragedy, because in that arrogance lies our downfall. And so let me give you some literary examples. You have heard of Dr. Faustus, maybe. You have heard of Voldemort, surely. Tom Riddle. By the way, really cool thing, if you go to Edinburgh, the place where J.K. Rowling wrote the first volume of Harry has burned down, but behind it is the cemetery where she went for walks, and as you walk in this cemetery, you see Riddle, McGonagall, Granger. She got these names from tombstones, which is a really, really cool thing. You could tell all the Harry Potter geeks, because they're standing only in front of those tombstones taking pictures. It's fun. And so, Voldemort, Tom Riddle, and Faustus are basically the same person. They are people who want to know more than they think they should, and in so doing, what do? They destroy themselves. Faustus sells his soul to the devil so that he can make gold. Voldemort splits his soul into the Horcruxes and therefore destroys it. Harry Potter doesn't beat Voldemort. And of course, the real hero, who is Neville, doesn't beat Voldemort. Voldemort beats Voldemort. Because when all the Horcruxes are destroyed, there's nothing left of him. And so we see at the end of Christopher Marlowe's play, Christopher Marlowe, who was a contemporary of Shakespeare, as Faustus is descending into hell, the narrator says, "Cut is the branch that might have grown full straight, and burned is Apollo's laurel bough that sometimes grew within this learned man. Faustus is gone. Regard his hellish fall, whose fiendful fortune may exhort the wise only to wonder at unlawful things, whose deepness doth entice such forward wits to practice more than heavenly power permits." Mary Shelley, who wrote the best horror story in history at the age of 19. She, very rich, with her very rich friends, including her husband, Percy Bysshe Shelley, and Lord Byron, are in a villa, Lake Como, Lake somewhere in Switzerland, I think, and they all decide to write horror stories, and she dozes on a rainy day. She dozes on a couch, and she has this vision of a creator standing over a creature, and she wakes up and she writes Frankenstein at 19. So if you really think you're a good writer, you're not Mary Shelley. I'm 58, I'm not Mary Shelley. And in it, what does she tell? She tells the story of the young man, Frankenstein, who is so taken with knowledge, like David Hume, that he thinks he can figure it all out. He creates a creature that he cannot control. What does the creature do? Destroys Frankenstein's family. So that at the end, Mary Shelley has Frankenstein saying, "Learn from me. Learn from my arrogance. Learn from my lack of humility, that I didn't follow the boundaries." And this is the beginning of the first Jurassic Park movie, the only good Jurassic Park movie as far as I'm concerned, but that's just me. And at the beginning, now I'm fascinated by stem cell research, right? So when our daughter was born, we kept the stem cells from her umbilical cord because Lord knows what they're going to be able to do with those, so it's frozen somewhere. And the notion that if my daughter someday needs a kidney, we can grow a kidney from those cells makes me excited. But the fact that people can say, "No, I want a tall kid with brown eyes," and they go in and fix it, that scares the crap out of me. So what are the limits? So the story of Jurassic Park is that they find the DNA of a dinosaur, but they don't have the entire DNA. There's a little gap, so they put in some frog DNA. What could go wrong? And so the world's best skeptic, whom we all know, Jeff Goldblum, says to the creator of all this, "The lack of humility before nature displayed here staggers me. Your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could do something, they didn't stop to think if they should do something." And humility, I think, helps that. I just want to go to the last two major takeaways, because I don't know whether it's me or you, but this room is very wrong. So what? So who cares? So I write a book on humility, which I hope people buy because my daughter started college, and this ain't cheap. Hint, hint. I think it's important to understand that humility is a disposition, and a fundamental way of looking at the world. Those of you who wear glasses, do you remember the first time you got glasses or a new prescription, and you put them on and you went, whoa, I was driving without these? You're smiling, you know, right? I drove without these? What, was I crazy? Those of you who have had the blessing of falling in love and realizing that love is not like and it's not lust, and you go, oh, that's what that is. Now I got it, right? That changes the way you look at the world. If, God forbid, the tests come back and say cancer, that changes fundamentally how you see the world. I'd like to argue that being humble changes the entire way you see the world. It's not humility, it's not low self-esteem, it's a healthy sense of me. What perspective? Where do I fit in time? Where do I fit in my family? Where do I fit in my society? How can I contribute? And what can't I contribute? Which means I need somebody else to help me, right? You break a leg, you go to the doctor's office. Why? They have the expertise that you don't have. And so, therefore, if you're humble, you have to talk to other people. You can't talk only to yourself. This is the problem, right? We have these what's that called? Confirmation, what's that called? Where you only read Facebook pages that agree with you. Confirmation bias, thank you. Confirmation bias, right? There's nobody that challenges anybody else in the group. So if you're self-aware, like Erev Passover, Yom Kippur, then you want to fix your flaws, and I hope that it works against stubbornness. Some of the most arrogant people I know are bullies. They're intellectual bullies. They won't explain to me why their position is right. They'll threaten me with authority, right? That doesn't convince me. And so the first takeaway is that humility is a disposition. And the second is that humility makes you vulnerable and therefore grateful. It makes you vulnerable because you realize what skills you don't have, and it makes you grateful when you find the people who can complement your skills, your desires, your flaws. And so, being humble. Now, I want you to think about whenever you began, I'll use a terrible example, but whenever you began to be aware of politics in your life, whatever age that is, whether it's the last 5 years, or 10 years, or 40 years, or 50 years. I don't see, to use an example, a lot of politicians standing up and saying, I was wrong. I need help. I need to reach across the aisle to people who are not of my race, ethnicity, gender, public stance, politics. Because if you do, you might realize that your enemy might be right. And you might have to trust your enemy. And so therefore, if you're vulnerable, I think that stops you from what Jacob Burckhardt was saying. The world exists for me. It did not exist before May 5th, 1965, the day I was born, and it will not exist after I am born. And I know that that's BS, right? That's really, really stupid. So we might ask, when people, someone asked me, why did I write this book? And I said, it's the candle I can light in the darkness. I can't change the fact that the Catholic Church is divided 50-50, that the United States is divided 50-50, that there are wars all over and civil wars all over the world. All I can do is write books and teach. And so my decision was, well, what if we don't have humility? Well, doesn't that lead to the arrogance of power? Doesn't that lead to the death of shame? But if we are moderates, and we are humble moderates, maybe we can go back to something that we don't talk about enough, and that is the common good. So I think ultimately, if you're looking for one virtue that can bring us back to the common good, it's humility, the secret virtue. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Galito. So
Nobody ever wants to ask the first question, so we'll move to the second question. Mary.
Just a little comment. I once heard a definition of humility that I thought was fascinating. Humility is accepting the truth. So if you are, you have, the wherewithal to realize that, you have these faults and, or you have a talent, that you accept that, and that's a kind of humility.
I think it's great, that notion is fabulous, because the truth is there whether you like it or not.
Right.
I mean, to be really bald, right? So my wife went through cancer, right? We've had a child since then, she's going to live to be 100, it's wonderful. But there's nothing I could do to take away the cancer. I could yell, I could scream, I could cry, I did all of those things. And when all that was done, I had to then act in light of the truth. Right? So a banana is not a crayon. I don't understand how people live in a fact-free world. I happen to live in the real world. And so it's one of the things when I look at the political world, when people just say, I think it's true that, and in my class, I use a lot of primary sources. I'm kind of like a great books teacher. I always say, where in the text does it say that? Well, I don't care what you feel. Where in the text does it say that? And then you tell me your interpretation of it. So I think that's a great way of looking at it. Thank you. Yes?
Professor, could you give us your personal definition of humility?
Yeah, so I think I'm often asked, when I did the book on ageless wisdom, what is the definition of wisdom? And I say this as somebody who, you have to understand that I'm a believer. I'm on the way left of the church, way left. I go to church most Sundays. And so I think that wisdom and humility are seeing the world through the eyes of God. However, I think you could say wisdom and humility are seeing the world through the eyes of others. Particularly the wise elder. For me, it's the wise elders of my life. So to give you an example, when our daughter started college and did not have a good first 3 days, and we were on the phone a lot, I can remember WWJD, what would Jesus do? People wear that. So I was thinking WWJD, what would Joni do? Because Joni is my mother, and I'm like my daughter, and so I relied on I did not know what to do. I had to go to other models. I went to my mother's models of how she dealt with me. I found that a very humbling moment, and I was so grateful that I had my mother. So that's my flawed answer to that question.
I guess my question would be, what inspired you to really do a deeper research on humility and wisdom and just those sort of topics? Because I kind of feel like it's not a really talked about common topic. So yeah, just kind of what brought you to that?
That's a great question. Thank you for that. I am what's called an historian of ideas. I'm technically speaking an intellectual historian, which means an historian of ideas, and I typically study change in church, reform, and a lot of the virtues that I think help a human being reform, or an institution like the church reform, or maybe Congress reform, are all based on self-reflection. And so my question was, how do you self-reflect, right? And for me, the answer was growing up in a house that had an immigrant grandmother in the Bronx. She was not an educated woman, but she was a very wise woman. There's a difference between those two. And so I started to think about the interplay between wisdom and elders. And that I did not go into that first book from 2016 thinking in 2023 I would publish a book on humility. The material told me. Because I started to come up with, well, if I want to get wisdom from someone else, I have to realize that there's something I don't know, that they know. And so that's, the project suggested itself to me. I didn't say, in 2015, this whole country is screwed up, I'm gonna write a book about humility, to tell people to be humble, and then somehow, we won't have riots in Charlottesville over, modern day racists. That didn't happen that way. I mean, Gawain, who's reading Gawain? Right, so the Gawain people, right, Gawain doesn't wake up and say, I'm gonna go on this journey. He reacts to the fact that this green guy walks in and chops his head off, gets the head chopped off. So sometimes stuff comes to you. And that's why I don't know what the next book is, because nothing's come to me. And I think I'm kind of cool with that. If something comes, okay, but... Hi, yes?
I think in today's society, humility is kind of turned like a negative characteristic. It's not really honest, it's not positive or virtue. It's more like defeatist, you gave up, that type of thing. And I think it's prevalent in our society. Humility isn't really honest, it's virtue.
I think humility in the world in which we're living today is a vice. It's for wimps, it's for weak people, and I think that could not be more wrong. I think it gets it entirely wrong. But in this world, it's very hard to have quiet voices heard. And so sometimes you've got to get a little loud with it. But I think it's very every generation is supposed to pass a world off that's better to the next generation, and our daughter got so angry with saying, well, your generation will fix this. She really got angry, and she's not a loud kid, and she once slammed the table, and she's your age, and she said, your generation has screwed this up so much, I'm not sure we can fix it. And that was a pretty humbling moment. That was like, whoa! Especially when your kid tells you you're wrong. So we just stopped feeding her, which was the way to go. And you know what was great about that? Our savings went up. My daughter goes to college. I have more chores and less laundry. I don't get it.
When it comes to sharing the gospel, how can someone be bold about the gospel but still be humble about sharing it?
I think it's a great question, and I think the answer is personal experience. I mean, I don't react well to people telling me, have you accepted Jesus as your personal Savior? I just don't react. I don't react well to anybody who's telling me the answer to the world's problems are X, because I think that they're selling something. Did I mention I'm selling a book? No. I think that they're selling something, and so I think what's much more powerful is personal witness. I think that's one of the reasons Pope Francis has trouble breaking through, because he's so quiet. But a lot of people are kind of looking at him and going, oh, that's what it's supposed to be like. And so I find steadiness helps me. Being consistent to the great degree that we can as human beings helps. And I think, there are lines whatever your principles are, there are lines you won't cross, but we live most of our lives in the gray. And so, I discuss with my students in raising our daughter, we would tell her when we were struggling, when we don't have all the answers. By the way, when you become a parent, you'll realize your parents have been faking it this whole time. We have no idea what we're doing, right? But as long as you're steady, I think that is the best. Our lives are marathons. The problem is everybody's sprinting, right, to the next news cycle. Okay, you're complaining about a problem. You're right. What's your solution? What's next? And I think that steadiness helps.
In all of your vast background
It's not that fast.
and reading, history, and so forth and so on, life, who is the most genuine example of true humility?
My mother. My mother, who was smarter than my father. But my father came from tremendous poverty. I and my two brothers never bought shoes for our children until they were 5 years old. because my father didn't have shoes when he was in the Depression, and so he bought shoes for our kids. That's the poverty that he came from. And he put himself through college and put himself through law school. My mother, who I think was naturally brighter than my father, but grew up in the 30s and 40s and 50s and was the dutiful wife, and then got a master's degree and became a teacher, was this slow and steady. My mother always knew who she was, and this slow and steady person. And my mother is always the person who says, "You're wrong, I'm wrong, he's wrong, she's wrong, get help." So I think it's that steadiness, and my mother knows who she is. My mother has always known who she is, and she's my model. I mean, the reason I'm a teacher is that I wanted to be like my mother, who was a teacher. So it doesn't help you in answering that question because you don't know my mother, but she's really a cool person.
Yeah, I was thinking of someone we've all heard of.
Yeah.
Literature or.
Right, I think that I'm
Bible.
too jaundiced an historian to gild the lily on Gandhi, or, you know, all human beings have their flaws, and any name that I put out, you know, gets wrapped up in other perceptions. So I'm sorry that that's not a satisfying answer, but it's my answer. I mean, but we can look at characters, right, in literature as precautionary tales. Yeah.
I was just looking at it in the whole. Great presentation, Chris.
Thank you.
Looking at this arrogance of power, the next book. Arrogance of power versus the death of shame, and vice versa. Where are we headed? That's something that moved me.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I'll leave that to someone else to write, but one of the very hard lessons I had to learn in my life was when I would look at people who were doing the wrong thing and were given like the example of, you know, here's an exit ramp for you, here's a way for you to get out of the situation. In Italian, we have this expression, bella figura, a good face. So you've screwed up. We know you've screwed up, but we're going to let you go out without firing you so you won't be humiliated. And those people don't take the exit ramp. And I realized, it's a very hard lesson for me to learn, never expect honor from people without shame. You ever meet those people and realize, wow, you and I have nothing in common. The way you were raised and the way I was raised, we have nothing in common here. You ever look at people in literature, in politics, and you think, what, do you have any principles? There's a difference between people who are immoral and people who are amoral. I understand people who are immoral. I don't understand people who are amoral. They have no morals whatsoever. Today, black is good. Tomorrow, black is bad. Based on what? What's good for me. And that's terrifying. And I see a lot more of that in the world in which I live now. Which is why you study great works of literature, right? What are you going to read in Lewis?
We're going to read two of the Chronicles of Narnia, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and also The Dawn Treader, and we're going to read Till We Have Faces.
I mean, think of, okay, so you've read Lord of the Rings, right?
Well, that's, I mean, they're not all mine.
I know, but like, you've read Lord of the Rings, you've seen The Hobbit, you've seen Lord of the Rings, right? Oh, I'm sorry, I'm gonna screw up the ending, but Frodo fails. Frodo does not return the ring. Sam is probably a good example. Samwise Gamgee is probably a very good example of humility, because he says, I can't carry the ring, but I can carry you. It's the best definition of love you'll ever find in literature. I can't carry your pain, but I can carry you while you're in pain. And Sam doesn't think much of himself. In fact, he thinks kind of little of himself. So there would be a really, really good example. So great literature complicates things, because Frodo is no great hero.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things in Tolkien and Lewis is everybody needs help in some way or another, and that's like, you made that part of your definition.
Right. I mean, and someone like Saruman, who's good who turns bad, right?
Yeah, he doesn't recognize them.
That he doesn't recognize, he's lost his way. We know people, right, in our lives who've lost their way.
Absolutely. Any other questions for Dr.
I think the flyer for your talk said something, I think it said like a lost virtue, and I was wondering if you could say a bit about when and how it got lost and how we got to this place where it can even be considered a vice.
Yeah.
Is it just at
Well, I mean, the cliche is everything was fine until the Middle Ages ended, which is actually true.
What
But
was the question?
and so the question is, where did we lose our way? Where did humility turn from being a virtue to the vice of humiliation up to the modern world? And I think it's easy to say, along comes the scientific revolution and everybody becomes arrogant. And I don't think that that's the case, because we have examples of Abelard in the 11th century who has no guardrails. I mean, there's this guy named Bernard of Clairvaux, and he kind of persecutes Abelard, not because Abelard is trying to figure everything out, but because he's trying to figure everything out without guardrails. That's kind of the nervousness, right? So I think that there are plenty of examples in the ancient world, the Roman attitude of lowliness and things like that. What I think the Middle Ages got right, that I would like to recover, is this sense of balance, this sense of faith and reason, of fides et ratio, that you could be a person of faith and a person of science. Or if you're not a person of faith, you can understand that, you know Neil deGrasse Tyson?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, I really like Neil deGrasse Tyson, but he denigrates people of faith, and that bothers me, right? But there was a greater sense of balance, I think, in the Middle Ages, rather than the either-or. And it's when you go into the either-or, which is stronger in the scientific revolution, and is stronger in the Enlightenment, so that Mary Shelley sticks out because she's an outlier, that there's something about, and I think it's the pace of change, right? It's kind of like the internet. So the internet is Satan, right? It promises you everything and ultimately delivers nothing, right? The way back, I think, is what's happening now. I feel like there's a blowback against technology. You know, I meet students who are writing on paper and pencil, and I ask them why, and they say, because I spend my entire life on a screen. And I think that's really mature and cool. Because the screen stuff helps and it does make life easier, except when it doesn't. If you've ever been trapped in an airport and you're supposed to use your app and the app doesn't work, and nobody knows what to do next, because we've lost thinking. So and I have to say, this is my own soapbox, we've cut the humanities for the last 50 years. What do you lose when you cut the humanities? Your humanity, right? And so I think we've let the technology outrun ourselves, and that is a function of the Industrial Revolution. Yes?
Do you think the loss of humility...
I'm sorry.
Sure. Do you think the loss of humility, or at least our appreciation for it, is more of an American problem, or do you think it's a global issue, or intercultural?
I haven't traveled enough other than as a guest, as a visitor, as a tourist. I haven't lived in other cultures to say that. I think that from afar, I see examples of arrogance in leaders of other countries, yes. But I certainly do not think that the United States is the only 50-50 country in the world. That's where we are. There's this very strong rise of authoritarianism around the world that's absolutely terrifying. You know, I have to tell you that as an historian, you're an Americanist, so maybe this resonates with you. As an historian, when I watch January 6th, forget whether you like Trump or don't like Trump, like Biden or don't like Biden. When I watched January 6th, I thought, 240 years, that was a pretty good run.
Yeah.
Right? Because I study empires that are 500 years old. That was, I swear to God, that was my reaction. Right? We could see that in Israel tomorrow. Right? We could see it in China. Look at Hong Kong. I think we're concluded. Thank you. Thank you again.
And I hope you all enjoyed it. Dr. Lear, you really delved into, I think, some of the things that are most crucial. And I just want to mention, and I refer to the series you do, the medieval Christian humanism. I'm sure that must have led in some ways to this, because you're steeped in a tradition that values these things that, as I said, we've lost. And one way or another, this sense of humility before God and truth. So anyway, thank you, everybody. I hope my students signed the thing. If you didn't, please do.
Sign the thing.
Yeah,
Sign the thing.
there's a paper. I'm going to be very inarticulate, but they know what I mean.
I know what you mean.
And help yourself to the food if you haven't gotten anything to eat.